So for those that haven't been before, or even those that have, you realise the talks we try and get for the day are not all just deep dive tech talks. You saw in Casey's talk there, you know, awesome story, but also some pretty thought-provoking stuff there, especially towards the end. We try and get a real mix, red, blue, tech, non-tech, and I'm actually quite interested in this next one. Jordan's an ex-lawyer? Or yep. Are you ever an ex-lawyer? I don't know, it's kind of, yeah.
I have my license, but I no longer practice.
So don't hold that against him. But this talk is all about active defence or hacking back, you know, and the legalities around that from someone that is actually a lawyer, so can talk to the law. So please make Jordan feel welcome.
Thank you for that introduction. Out of all the introductions I've received, that's by far the most recent one. I did want to come out today and teach you guys how to hack shit, but maybe we can catch up in the break and do that. I am an Australian lawyer, but I'm also a senior cybersecurity advisor, so I've tried to blend both of those elements in today's presentation. So today, I'm going to tell you a story. And it starts with once upon a time, and it ends with cool story, isn't it? So once upon a time, there was a guy named Swim. Oh, and by the way, there's bonus points for all of you if you can determine the real identity of Swim by the end of this presentation. So, once upon a time, there was a guy named Swim. Swim stands for someone who isn't me. So Swim was laying back in his hammock, relaxing in the backyard of his house, when he received an alert that someone had accessed a file called passwords from his personal Dropbox. Swim had completely forgotten about it. It must have been about 3 years ago where he set up those canary tokens. Because someone had interacted with the file on his Dropbox, it automatically beaconed back an alert to Swim of the IP address that was responsible for these shenanigans. So this was real threat intelligence in real time. But Swim's heart started to feel a little bit heavy as he vaguely recalled that he may have put some malicious files in that location as well. Did he put malware in there, even temporarily? Oh man, and what about that spyware that he had too? For Swim, they were strictly for research purposes only. But what if the attacker who compromised his Dropbox also found those kind of files and uploaded them to the attacker's drop server, which the attacker would have then downloaded onto his own machine? I think most of you would agree it serves the attacker right. After all, the attacker would have stolen it from Swim. But what about Swim? Was he up for any liability here? Swim had to get to the bottom of this. So Swim went inside his house, he turned on his computer and he picked up his phone and he hit the forums and he laid out his problem and requested support for a solution. He also gave his mates a call and asked for their opinion. But he quickly realized that there was no consensus among those that he asked. Some people were saying that it was highly illegal and he'd be stitched up for hacking back. Others were saying it's completely fine and it will be considered a form of active defense, which supposedly they said was legal. And others were saying it's all covered in this shade of grey, but not to worry, because no prosecutor was ever going to prosecute him for a crime, given that Swim was the victim. So Swim put on his problem-solving hat and tried to form some kind of structure out of all of this feedback that he was getting. So first of all, there was a difference in what people were labeling it. and what was actually going on at a deeper level. So Swim started with the broader labels first, and it seemed logical to Swim that the best he could make of it was that hacking back was like sending a missile into someone else's space. Monitoring for missiles coming at you was like passive defense. And shooting missiles down when they crossed into your airspace or launching limited counterattacks in response to an attack in your area, that's active defense. So perhaps the canary token was active defense, but was the stolen malware and spyware really considered hacking back? So Swim was starting to get somewhere to understand this problem, but he needed to drill down into what was going on at a little bit of a deeper level. So later that afternoon, whilst he was celebrating his daughter's first birthday, he picked up a napkin and he went and sat down in the back corner and he wrote out a spectrum of 5 elements which were at play and which were of increasing intensities. So first, you had attribution. This was about identifying who Swim attacker was. So this is something which happened with the beaconing, which allowed Swim to follow the file back to where it is and obtain the attacker's IP address. It did require the leaving of Swim's own systems, and it did run the risk of implicating innocent third parties, but there was definitely no immediate harm to anyone else. Next was infiltration. So this was about assessing the attacker's computer, introducing code to their environment, collecting their files, their keystrokes, their screenshots, etc., or otherwise just gathering intel about them and how they operate. So this was about following the attackers back and having a look around, but not causing any destruction. So this was probably the stage the malware and the spyware were at the moment, because he hadn't further interacted with them, but they could provide opportunities if he chose at the next few stages. So the next one was deletion. So this is about infiltrating into the attacker's environment, searching for the files that were stolen, and taking action to prevent those files being used by the attacker. So perhaps by deleting them or encrypting them. But it's about trying to recover what's stolen and prevent the attacker from any type of use. So it Swim's data, but it's in the attacker's environment, and there's a fine line at this point between interfering with Swim's property versus the attacker's computer. So the next phase was exploitation. So that's about gaining access to an attacker's computer or network and asserting control to prevent or contain any further attacks. So this might include interfering, controlling assets, installing code, creating confusion, deception, misdirection, or even creating a sinkhole. It's at this stage where for Swim, it feels like we would be taking things a little bit too far, like we're crossing the lines, because it starts to feel like you're being the attacker yourself. So the last phase was the destruction phase. So this is about taking the attacker, its assets, its infrastructure, its information out. So at this point, we'd be well over the line and we would be a full-fledged vigilante. So thinking about this, Swim breathed a sigh of relief as he formed the hypothesis that surely exploitation and destruction were what's illegal, and surely attribution is totally fine, and perhaps there's some grey around infiltration or deletion, but surely that's got to be fine too. So given that his situation hadn't escalated above level 2 at this stage, he thought he'd had nothing to worry about, and he went back to enjoying his daughter's birthday party. But over the next few weeks, Swim did some research in the evenings after work. He was collecting information to prove or disprove his hypothesis. So first of all, he looked at the legal position in Australia. having a look at the basic laws in place, Swim had some immediate concerns about his situation. State and Commonwealth laws all seem to be written fairly similar, and they basically prohibited accessing a computer or information without authorization or without a right. That would mean his canary token, his malware, his spyware were in fact illegal actions, even though they had only reached attribution and infiltration stages and were caused by the attackers themselves. So prima facie, the legislation in place in Australia would preclude you from doing just about anything with a computer without being authorized to do it or having a relevant right to do it, like a warrant. But what's immediately obvious is that the laws are quite dated, and the intent behind them is to apply to the attackers. So it's a little bit tricky to apply those laws into a posture where you're engaged in active defense or hacking back, even though when doing so, you do not have authorized access. And you know the laws that are in place that allow you to act in self-defense when physically attacked? Well, they haven't yet been developed in equivalent form in the cyber realm, but they should, and that's the expectation. So Swim was starting to see why there was a grey area. It is obvious now. Any prosecutor would be focused on the cyber criminals, the attackers, and they're likely to know that if they did try to prosecute a victim, it's only going to lead to changes in the law or favourability around the victim, so it's not a case that they're inclined to win. So perhaps some activities like attribution and infiltration might be overlooked by law enforcement when you're the victim engaged in active defense. Swim was quite curious about reading into this issue further. So he sought out some contacts in the industry and met up with them for coffee. He explained his situation and his framework that he had developed for his thinking, and also the state of play with Australian laws. And what he found was that generally people in industry were split when it came to a positive view that active use of active defense techniques, with only about 10% in favour of moving towards legalising hacking back. Swim also met up for coffee with some contacts in the government to find out what was the government's approach, and that was quite different. So the Australian government were trying to meet the increasing threat landscape by giving its agents more training, more tools, more funding, and particularly to the deep state, a lot more power. But there still did seem to be some reluctance from the government to overtly step in to help. So Swim started to research this more and more around now what was taking place around the globe compared to what was taking place domestically. And it seemed that the US had been discussing the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Bill since about 2017. And this bill would have lifted restrictions on hacking back by providing a legislative defense to prosecution when defending against unauthorized intrusions. An additional driver for this US bill was that the very nature of cybercrime was making it very difficult for law enforcement to respond to and prosecute in a timely manner. So the bill would have allowed for attribution, infiltration, even deletion, and even so far as exploitation, but just falling short of destruction. Now that's a lot of power. Although it seemed that law enforcement and government agencies in the US preferred to have the sole remit and responsibility for responding to cybercrime, the logistical enormity of that task, coupled with the vital importance of cybersecurity in the modern world, really did justify an exception to the general principle against justice being meted out by victims. Unsurprisingly, this issue is occupying the attention of policymakers in Europe. with Germany in particular sharing the exact same view as the US. If you have a look at China and Russia, they've been proactive in both internet governance and cybersecurity regulation, of which active defense strategy is an essential component. As with China and Russia, Singapore has been a leader in proactive cybersecurity in the Asia-Pacific for years. Singapore has allowed private entities to take active defense measures by amending its cybersecurity acts, and specifically, it began permitting the Singapore government to issue certificates directing specified persons to prevent, detect, or counter specific threats, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure and the financial services industry. That's when it really did hit Swim. This was no longer about him making sure he didn't get in trouble for the beaconing, the malware, and the spyware. This was about getting Australia to solve a problem, a big problem, and one which was confronting the world. Swim noticed that Verizon keeps producing reports which keep indicating the threat landscape is evolving. Organised criminals are turning to cybercrime with increasing sophistication and prevalence. Ransomware attacks are plaguing Australia. Supply chain attacks are causing Australia's regulators to tighten their regulatory screws and also to focus on the broader ecosystems. The hacking laws haven't changed for years. The government is trying to meet these threats, but they don't have the sufficient resourcing, capabilities, or capacities to respond in a timely manner. And what's happening to Australian companies as a result of this? Are we merely focusing on passive defense, basic security controls, firewalls, antivirus, patch management, scanning, and monitoring? Swim was annoyed, and he was certain that something needed to be done. So Swim knuckled down over the ensuing next few months. It became winter, it became cold, but the fire within Swim continued to burn strongly. Swim formulated some key priorities which he thought would move things in a better direction. The first was to facilitate better communications and information sharing between Australian businesses, broader industries, and the broader ecosystem. The second was, of course, to develop greater cyber deception capabilities and increase the deployment of deception technologies. Now, it's worth noting that both information sharing and cyber deception are forms of active defense. The third was to ensure governance was accounted for with an appropriate addendum to the NIST CSF. And last was to ensure Australia was making a step change when it came to authorising active defence powers. So for Swim, it was no surprise that cooperating with law enforcement and the network of companies and organisations that are combating hacking was an important part of an active defence strategy. The UK financial services industry is a really good example. Very publicly and annually, and for some time, they have conducted industry-wide war games to work on this coordination aspect. We do know that it is happening in Australia at the enterprise level from time to time, but behind closed doors, and certainly not so much in the public domain. But Swim's intent was encouraging Australian small and medium businesses to start to join in that war game activity. Swim was also passionate about cyber deception, and he enrolled himself into a SANS active defense course. In that course, Swim learnt a little bit more about increasing the overall work effort an attacker would have to expend to break into your environment. Specifically, Swim was tooled up to waste the attacker's time trap and contain attacks, alert security teams to attacker activity so that it could be monitored, and also help with attribution and discovery. SWIM, filled with this tooling and knowledge, began to litter the environments he traversed with honeydocs and executables. SWIM used well-chosen file names to attract attackers' attention, like fake KeyPass databases and fake network diagrams. But a word of advice from SWIM, just let others know in the organization when you deploy to avoid a whole heap of frustrations down the track. If you're looking for some free tools to consider when you are looking to get familiar and just play around with active defense strategies, one of the better starting points is the honeypot, a relatively versatile one to tinker with, and one that's well documented from a usage standpoint is OpenCanary. So OpenCanary makes a good starting point because conceptually it's fairly simple. It runs services and triggers when someone connects to them, and the services in question are designed to emulate a particular device configuration like Windows or Linux server. So industry standards and best practice. To bring it all together, and as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, SWIM built upon existing frameworks and ideas, and what fell out of that was an addendum to the NIST CSF domains, being a domain called revenge. So that category, that control domain included, stimulate remorse, burn their tools, hack back, deploy interception tech, and collaborate with your peers. And there were so many controls within that domain, venom, poison, what have you not. They've been tailored back to be something that's professional and appropriate. SWIM recognized that there needed to be some change in cybersecurity laws, particularly for prosecuting cyber crimes, and that was something that was well overdue. But SWIM was painfully aware that there was still that canary token, that malware and spyware hack, and he wasn't quite out of the clear yet. So he did his best to lobby, raise awareness for this issue, but unfortunately the wheels of the law move slowly and take time, and he might not be able to achieve this for some time yet. But to be clear, SWIM wasn't advocating for a Wild West, and he pulled a napkin out of his pocket, the one which he wrote on his spectrum of 5 elements, and he looked at it and he concluded that at least attribution, infiltration, and probably deletion would serve best, as these are some of the lower risk, lower impact activities that generally do make up what's called active defense. So the outcome SWIM was looking for was for the Australian government to change its outdated laws, to put some new rules in place that tell you what you can do and what you can't do, or at the very least, to provide some authorization or deputy to Australian companies in certain circumstances to give them space where they could work on active defense on their own. Now, with SWIM going through all of these processes, he became pretty familiar with the arguments for each side, and it was fairly contentious. Those for hacking back tend to argue that if cybercrime can be accurately attributed and that any kind of response is reasonable and proportionate, in the absence of greater government involvement, hacking back is really the only realistic solution to the increase in sophistication and frequency in the threat landscape. Those that are against hacking back note that there's so many risks associated with it, and it can have unintended questions. First, there is considerable difficulty associated with identifying the attacker, and even if the hack works, a victim may simply have invited further retaliation. Now let's think about if Australian companies pissed off China, for example. what's going to happen there in terms of retaliation, and how friendly do you think the Australian government will then be to you? Second, counterattacks can also damage any hijacked computers belonging to innocent third parties, and that is a real kind of grave concern. And third, most companies don't have the skill set internally to effectively take affirmative countermeasures against cybercriminals. They're finding it hard enough at the moment to implement defense mechanisms to prevent attacks in the first place, let alone having to focus on arming staff with the skill set to effectively hack back, as this takes this to an unprecedented level. So I might just pause Swim's story there, because we have many bright minds in the room, and I think it's important to find out what everyone here thinks about Australian private companies hacking back or engaging in active defence. So we'll start with the hell yes. So I'll count to 3, and if you're a hell yes, put up your hand and say hell yes. 1, 2, 3.
Hell yeah.
Okay, if you're a hell no, on 3, say hell no and put up your hand. 1, 2, 3.
Hell no.
Oh man, I think that's going to have to be 50-50, unfortunately. A heated battle and a tie even in here. So the moral of the story is, first, please, please, please don't go out and do what I did. I mean, please don't go out and do what Swim did. Wait, did I just give away the true identity of Swim? Maybe not. Well, anyway, I'm not advocating that we should all go out and head gung-ho to a Wild West with full-blown hacking back. But what I am proposing is that the time has come to permit hacking back in particular circumstances, and perhaps we should all allow for a step change a little bit further down the higher risk and higher impact pathway of active defence. So, cool story, isn't it?